And it's there that we turn to our first guest today and also mention there's another CEO who is weighing in on these issues, and that's Amazon's Jeff Bezos. He voiced some support for raising the corporate tax rate. Didn't give a specific number, but he does say in a statement, we support the Biden administration's focus on making bold investments in American infrastructure. Let's bring in Stephen Rattner now. He is Willett Advisors chairman and CEO. And Steve, you, in an op-ed that's about to be published in the New York Times, talk about what that infrastructure plan should look like. But before we get to the details of that, I do want to ask you about the tax question, because it really seems to be a thorny one for corporate America right now, with a lot of debate about where exactly that level should be. What are you hearing from clients about their concerns about the tax rate? And I should mention, not just on the corporate front, but on the personal, for wealthy individuals front as well.
Sure. Why don't we split that into the pieces? Let's start with the corporate side. Look, and I guess this applies to individuals as well. Nobody likes to pay higher taxes. Nobody wants to pay higher taxes. So obviously, there's going to be some grumpiness about the Biden proposals so far on the corporate side. We will soon get, or eventually get, proposals on the individual side. The problem on the corporate side is pretty simple, in my mind anyway, which is that we, for better or for worse, live in a global world. And so we don't control our own destiny entirely when it comes to corporate taxes, because what we've learned is that companies can shift both legitimately and somewhat illegitimately their profits to other jurisdictions which have lower tax rates. And so it has been on a global basis a race to the bottom in corporate tax rates. Ireland famously, I think, is at 12.5%. Even Britain was below 20%, although I think they're now raising it a bit. Canada has a very low corporate tax rate, and so forth. And so I think the most important thing that's going on at the moment that we shouldn't lose sight of is Janet Yellen's initiative to create a global minimum tax rate. I don't know if she'll succeed or not. It's in the interest of all the OECD members who she's talking to agree to something like that. But that is a big part of the yin and the yang over corporate taxes. If we had a global agreement, we could raise our corporate taxes without worrying about jobs and companies and profits leaving the US. Without one, this is part of why corporate taxes were lowered, which was to keep us competitive with the rest of the world. But all in all, corporate taxes should go up. They are a smaller and smaller percentage of our federal budget. Companies are contributing less and less in tax revenue relative to what individuals are paying, and that needs and should be reversed.
Stephen, I do want to ask you about the carbon tax. Jamie Dimon did came out in his annual letter today, says he does support a carbon tax. Do you support that? And is that a good idea?
Yes, as Julie mentioned, I've just written a piece for the Times, which will be published shortly, in which, in fact, among other things, I argue for a carbon tax. It is the simplest, most effective way for us to deal with the environmental problem. You use market incentives, taxes, to drive behavior, as opposed to pages and pages, thousands and thousands of pages of government regulations trying to force people to do things. Taxes get that to happen. If you put a $43 a ton tax on carbon, it would roughly raise gasoline prices by 38 cents. That would significantly diminish driving. I know that there'd be an adverse impact on people of lesser means. And so I would propose taking that tax revenue and rebating it through the tax system to people below the top income level, so that they are not hurt by it, but it does change behavior and drive people bit by bit, no pun intended, away from driving and toward other modes of transportation and so forth, all through the energy system.
Steve, as you mentioned, in that op-ed, there is a lot in that Biden proposal, 76, I think, as you flagged for us, different plans that they have in place. What do you like in there, as you've seen so far? And what areas are you concerned about, there not being, I guess, in your broad outline, enough thought about how the private sector can play a role in getting some of these initiatives off the ground?
I think the first thing to understand about both packages, the last one, the American Rescue Plan, 1.9 trillion, and now the American Jobs Plan, 2.25 trillion, is that they were both kind of Trojan horses. They were both put forward to address a problem, but actually try to address a whole lot of other problems. The first package was supposed to be a COVID relief bill in name, but it included all kinds of other stuff in it that was really unrelated to COVID, frankly, including many of those stimulus checks that went to people who were unaffected by COVID. This is a bit of the same thing. We call it an infrastructure bill. It's a simple thing to call it, but only by, depending on how you count, 35, 40% at the most of what's in this bill is for infrastructure. The rest is for all kinds of other things, including, and I'm not being critical of the need, but I'm a little critical of calling it infrastructure, $400 billion. So almost 20% of this bill is to raise the pay of home health care workers. And again, that may be and is a pressing need, but it's not infrastructure. So that's one thing we have to be aware of. And the second thing is there are 76 at least initiatives in this bill. I counted them. Many of them completely unspecified as to how they would work. And in my opinion, they rely too heavily, again, similar to the carbon tax, on government mandates, government directives, government investing in startup kinds of energy projects, clean energy projects. That is very scary to me. And I think there are ways, like the carbon tax, to use the private sector to implement a lot of these very admirable goals in a much more tax and cost efficient way for the American public, American taxpayer.
Steve, you allude in your piece to the sort of mistrust of big corporations, particularly on the part of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, as maybe something that is holding back more willingness to get those public-private partnerships going. You know, we have seen an activism on the part of corporate America really like never before. I mean, the Georgia voting rights bill being the latest example of that. Do you think that Americans are starting to or should start to maybe trust corporate America a little more, or is there some peril in that?
Yeah, I do think the gulf that has come to be between corporate America and particularly Wall Street, even more than a typical regular corporation, but the financial world, the gulf and mistrust and dislike and fear and all those things that's come to pass really very much within the Democratic Party, but also probably outside of it. When you look at this administration, it's filled with incredibly talented people, but an extraordinarily small number of them that come from the private sector in the true sense of the word, that are really private sector people. And I think business and Wall Street have become a bit of a dirty word or dirty words in the democratic world, and I think that's a bit unfair. I think that there are many of us in the private sector who are trying to do the right thing, who are in favor of progressive policies, who want to see this country move forward on climate change and on helping people at the bottom and racial justice and all the important issues of our day. And I don't think, frankly, we get very much credit for feeling that way.
Stephen, a large part of the infrastructure package, you just mentioned it is in the hands of government to allocate the spending and investment decisions behind this, at least for right now and how it's structured. Is that one of the biggest risks that could reduce the economic output of this plan? Because look where this infrastructure investment over the past 50 years have gotten us. A lot of potholes and a lot of dilapidated bridges, and it has been government driven.
Well, first, on your last point, yes, we do have potholes and bad bridges. I don't know that that's a failure of government to spend money well. It's a failure of government to spend money. The amount of our budget at the federal level, anyway, that has been devoted to infrastructure and R&D, two very important government functions, has been falling for 40 years. And that is a tragedy. And that is part of why there is such public support for doing something now. Yeah, look, I think it is critically important that if this bill is passed, that it be implemented well. 76 initiatives, at least, maybe more, does scare me when you think about a typical bill might have 2 or 3, and now we're kind of on steroids. But if government fails to implement this well, and if when the dust settles, the American public looks back on it and says, this was a failure, that is going to make it very tough for the next president to lean in and do things like this. We are witnessing the biggest experiment in government activism since certainly the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, possibly arguably since the New Deal. And it's got to work for this to have credibility, or else the next guy who comes along is going to do what Ronald Reagan famously did in 1980 and say government is not the solution, government is the problem. And people will believe him because in 1980, government wasn't functioning. So it's going to be incumbent on the Biden administration, not just to get this plan passed, but to implement it well in a way that people will look at it and say, this was great. This really made the country better. And in that context, I do worry that there's not much use of the private sector, either human capital or human resources in the government, or partnering and using tax incentives and using the private sector to make this work and be implemented as effectively as possible.
The stakes are high, as you say. Thank you so much, Stephen. On a lighter note, always love a little dose of Matisse in the morning when we talk to you, and love the art in the background. It always gives me a little bit of a lift. Steve Rattner of Willett Advisors, appreciate your time.